Alright. We are here. We are here to do some flying. Let me pull up. Alright, so I got that. Alright, very good. I got my Spotify pulled up and ready to go for when I hit the air. Let's take a look here. We're going to go ahead and use this Cessna 172 Skyhawk G1000. So this is going to be our plane. Very good then. And again, we're going from KPRC Prescott to KPHX Phoenix. So pretty much just Love Field and Prescott down to Sky Harbor. I actually live in Prescott, Arizona. Wow, these are very updated photos. That's super cool. Yeah, I live in Prescott, Arizona. About somewhere around Chair. Right? No. I'm over Chair somewhere. Yeah. I'm somewhere over Chair in this area. But yeah, so I'll be flying Chair. Looks like I'm gonna be taking off 21 left, heading south. Make a slight turn, and we're coming in on runway 26, so the northernmost airstrip here with a westward approach. So very good. Everything's live, so it's gonna be nighttime because it's about it's about 12:21 a.m. where I am. They got the time wrong because it says, why does it say this? Hang on, let me just make sure that everything's live. Okay, there we go, 121, there we go. This is wrong, only because it's actually 12:21 a.m., but that's all right. We got some cloudy skies to the north, but I don't think I'm gonna hit anything on the way down, so no problem. I am an amateur pilot in this game, very amateur. I'm not gonna be doing anything crazy as far as controls go, nothing like that. This is all gonna be pretty basic controls. So we're gonna get in the air, finish off our calls, switch over radio, and then go to, again, I don't know how to use the proper calls, but whatever. It's literally going to be the computer telling me what's up, and we're going to be flying straight down. So, and I'll turn on the podcast as soon as we get in the air. So, don't hit that fly button. All right, got it all pulled up here. 40,000 Cessna 172s have been produced. Most produced plane in the world. All right.
Prescott Tower, Cessna Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha, ready at runway 21 left south departure.
This is gonna be pretty dark for
Cessna Alpha
anybody
Sierra
watching.
X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha altimeter 30.13110 at 5.
I don't remember what I set my takeoff lights to.
Cleared for takeoff runway 21
So we're
left.
gonna do a little bit of button pressing first.
Cleared for takeoff runway 21 left Cessna Golf Sierra Alpha.
We're clear for takeoff according to this. We got me. We got. Oh, there was a second person there a moment ago. Don't know what happened to them. All right, so I gotta find out which one of these is my landing lights. Okay, for some reason it's not picking up my button mapping that I had, so give me one moment here. I literally had this mapped like 5 seconds ago. Okay. Should be good now. We good? What was going on? It was just mapped. Controller is unplugged, yes. Control options. Why is it giving me grief right now? I literally just mapped this like just a little while ago. So yes, yes, yes. Why is this giving me grief now? That's strange. It's almost like it's not picking up my controller at all. Oh, there we go. There we go. So there's my takeoff lights. Oh, there we go. Sorry, just trying to find it all. Yes, I'm aware of what the button is. Alright, so here we are. I'm going to get us a little bit spooled up and we'll be ready to take off. Here we go. Flaps down. Little GPS they got down there. Don't like the audio skipping. Okay. Raise the aircraft nose and lift off. Give me just a moment. 50 knots. Oh shit. Oh wow. Didn't like that. Flaps down 30 degrees and we're off. Fly straight over the runway. Bring those flaps up a little bit. Alright. We're up. I don't think this one has retractable gear. No, it's a Cessna 172. It does not have retractable gear. Are we heading southbound? We're just about southbound. So after we clear this strip, which we'll be having here shortly.
Golf Sierra Alpha, continue for south departure.
Alright.
Prescott Tower, Cessna Alpha, Sierra, X-Ray Golf, Sierra Alpha, continue for south departure.
Super amateur pilot here. Retract flaps. Take off for 17. Flaps are retracted. Flaps are at 0. Very good. Why do my flaps keep going back out? Hang on. I bet you there's like an auto flaps kind of thing going on here. Pilot avatar, co-pilot avatar. Oh wow, I didn't know I could do that. That's neato. I like that. We're going with a good tried and tested. These are cool. Alright, we're just gonna do this guy. This chick, instructor. No, we don't need an instructor in the pilot. So where, oh where, do I go for flying saves? Assistance options. Here we go. So, aircraft systems. We're going to go ahead and do failure and damage. Easy. Medium? Okay, that's what this is. Okay. Crash damage, enabled. Aircraft stress damage, enabled. Engine stress damage. Why not? That sounds like fun. Icing effect. We're going to go ahead and keep that off because I don't have anything mapped for the icing. Or for my de-icer is not mapped. Navigation aid. Off. That's totally fine. Notification. Aircraft systems. Flying tip. Yeah, that's all fine. That's all well and good. Piloting. Here we go. Assisted takeoff. Off. Assisted landing. Off. Assisted checklist. I'm not gonna worry about it. Assisted yoke. Yoke controls, pitch and roll, assist to main flight level. No, we don't want that. Auto trim. Off. Is this... Just whether you want the airpilot to offer anti-stall protection, temporarily overriding the yoke when the aircraft's angle of attack reaches unsafe levels. We're just going to keep that on. Yeah, we're going to keep that on. Assisted controller sensitivity. Okay, don't worry about that. We're just going to go and leave that on because it's interesting for me to know where everything is. Display direction chosen. No. User experience. End flight when aircraft shuts down. Where is the flaps? Yeah, sure. Unlimited fuel off. Aircraft lights on. Gyro drift off. Okay, what's up with the I'm gonna turn off auto rudder too. This is a checklist. Okay. So hopefully that'll help. Again, not sure why it's going to flaps automatically, but we're gonna go ahead and do it like this. Resume. Oh shit. Okay, we're good. We're
Don't
good.
sink. Don't sink. Don't sink.
We're good. I can fly it. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna be taking our left turn here. Flying over Embry-Riddle down there. That's Embry-Riddle directly to my, I guess that's my 11 low. There's an aeronautical university down there. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Some parks. I don't like the audio skipping. What's going on there? Oh my goodness. This is honestly, I think it's something on my end. It might just be this headset or something because it has been doing this for a little bit with other games too. Just real quick. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get this all done. I should have done this before the flight, so this is my bad. I'm going to turn that off though. Alright, there we go. Oh, not quite done with our turn yet. Alright, now I gotta maintain a steady rate of climb. So we're gonna go ahead and trim us. Oh, wrong way, wrong trim. There we go. We're gonna go ahead and trim us 7%, so that should give us a nice trim of 24. Alright, that's fine. Here we go. And we're off.
Cessna Golf Sierra Alpha leaving my airspace frequency change approved.
Prescott Tower Cessna Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha frequency change. Phoenix approach Cessna Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha Cessna Skyhawk 5 miles south of Prescott, 6,300 feet. Request flight following.
Cessna Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha Phoenix approach. Squawk 7712.
Squawk 7712 Cessna Golf Sierra Alpha.
Cessna Golf Sierra Alpha radar contact 5 miles south of Prescott, 6,700 feet. Altimeter tree 0.13.
Roger Cessna Golf Sierra Alpha.
And we are on our climb. Where's my climb rate indicator? I've actually never flown one of these things. They're very much more advanced than the ones with the oh, it's on the right there. Okay, gotcha. Let's see. Oh, this is gonna be a long flight. I can already tell this is gonna be a long flight. What's my cruising altitude anyway? Cruise. I'm not sure. Okay, so we're good. I'm gonna go ahead and set the trim.
Stall.
Nope, don't want to trim, don't want to stall. That should be fine right there. Right there. What's my airspeed? 50 knots? Ooh. Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and bring that nose down just a little bit, try to gain some airspeed while we're at it. I'm going slow as can be. So we're actually gonna just take full control. No more trim. There we go. Trim's kind of annoying. Off my takeoff lights there. So again, not quite sure what my cruising altitude is supposed to be. None of these things over here are saying what it's supposed to be. Nope. Come on now. Let's stay on track here. Okay, we're at 7460, so we're about just over 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet up from the ground right now. I feel like there's a few more clouds outside tonight than this is saying, but that's fine. No big worries. Alright, so this is where I turn on the Dan Carlin podcast, because this is going to be a long flight. So, bear with me. Here we go. The Celtic Holocaust.
If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list? And what's on it? And this is kind of an exercise, and you run into these things elsewhere, I'm sure, sort of a clarify your life and priorities exercise. Another one I've heard is go write your own obituary now. And you can see how that might help you get a sense of, oh, gee, this is what I'd like to be someday, and here's how far I am from that now, and sort of help you figure out how you're doing. The what would you be willing to die for question is a priority question. Helps you sort of figure out what are the most important things to me. And if you think about lists like that, I mean, I think we probably all have pretty similar things, at least at the top of the list, wouldn't we? I mean, wouldn't loved ones be on that list right near the top? I would be willing to die for my wife and children or parents. I have to believe that's pretty common in any era in history. And then likely something on that list near the top would be possessions of one kind or another. Land comes to mind right off the top of my head. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. I would give my life for it. The number of conflicts that were land ownership based since time immemorial is uncountable, isn't it? Pretty common. Other kinds of possession you might think of as like money. How long down on your list, though, does it go before you get to things that are a little harder to get your hands on tangibly? I mean, where's something like freedom on your list? And it's funny because if you go and look all throughout human history, there are slogans like New Hampshire's state motto, which is live free or die. And you go and you look at like revolutionary France and all these other movements throughout history, and some form of give me liberty or give me death, live free or die is on the list. I mean, people willing to give their own lives based on the idea that an unfree life isn't worth living. So willing to die for a concept, but a concept that means everything when you talk about your day-to-day life. And we should point out that freedom has always meant different things to different people and has meant different things in different eras. The 2 big definitions you run into is the obvious one. Freedom is my right to personal control and autonomy and sovereignty. The other one, though, is a political sort of freedom that says as long as no outside people or power or state or entity is controlling my people, then we're free. We may live in a dictatorship, but it's our dictatorship, that kind of thing. So freedom involves freedom from outside control. Now let me change the parameters of our little question, though, here for a minute. What if instead of giving your own life and what you would be willing to die for, the new list is what would you be willing to lose everything for? And by everything, I certainly mean your life. That's a given, but the lives of all your loved ones, one way or another, either through outright death or having them sold into a life of slavery, your little kids sold into a life of slavery, and all your possessions taken, and all your stuff stolen, and your community devastated, and your culture mortally wounded. That's pretty much everything, isn't it? What's worth that? Some of the greatest human tragedies, both on a personal and on a society-wide level throughout history, have happened when some of the things on the list that you'd be willing to die for become the cost of preserving other things on your list that you'd be willing to die for. And you see this all the time in the 20th century. Look at how many people, in order to protect their society's freedom, sent their own children off to die in a war. So this is part of the human condition. But unless you've lived through near genocidal conditions, most of us haven't had to deal with the kind of threat that people throughout history have had to deal with to everything. That general who coined New Hampshire's state motto, live free or die, was a Revolutionary War general, for example. He wrote that phrase decades after the war and in total freedom and safety. Now, I have no doubt he would have been willing to give his life in the service of what was a brand new country during the Revolutionary War. But he could also take some comfort in the idea that he wasn't going to have to give much more than that. I mean, the British were not going to come into the country and after they hanged him, execute his teenage sons and rape his wife and his children and send them off to slavery, burn down his house, destroy his town, and stamp out his church. They weren't going to do that. That's a different kind of risk, isn't it? That's genocide. And people still deal with that even as I'm speaking right now, somewhere in the world. Now, obviously, genocides
away,
come
but now
in
it's
many
back.
different shades and colors and variations and circumstances. I mean, take the Jews and the Gypsies in the Second World War during the Holocaust. That's an example where the people who were being victimized had absolutely no choice and no options. No one said to them, either do this or we're going to kill you all. A choice was never offered. Sometimes, though, it is. Choice A is you do this. Choice B is we commit a genocide or a near genocide or an absolute crime against humanity by modern day standards against you. I mean, for most of human history, that's the choice that cities have when enemy armies show up outside their walls. Surrender before the siege weapons start being used, and you
128.45
can
for
maybe go
Cessna Golf
free,
Sierra
maybe carry
Alpha.
some of your personal possessions with you, maybe not,
Albuquerque
but the
Center,
deal is
Cessna
that
Alpha
as
Sierra
soon as
X-ray
the
Golf
siege
Sierra
starts,
Alpha, 9,800
in most of these
feet.
cases, they could do whatever they wanted to. Sometimes they might still let you go. Sometimes they might have a negotiation 3 weeks from now and say, okay, do you want to stop it now? We'll make a deal. But oftentimes the deal was implicit. I mean, historian Hans Van Wees says that this is the standard understanding throughout most of pre-gunpowder history and even into gunpowder era history, that if you don't surrender when called upon and the city goes under siege, that you could have an absolute genocide, at least on a citywide level afterwards, and everyone will understand that that's just how it goes. They weren't doing that to civilizational equals much by the 18th century, which of course the British would have considered the colonists who 5 minutes ago had been, subjects of the same king as the British. But when you were dealing, for example, with savages or barbarians, those are obviously slur terms, all bets were off. In the history of the laws of war, there's a term for that, a Latin term, bellum Romanum, which basically means war the way the Romans did it. Total war. The legal definition I got from one place said that bellum Romanum is all-out war without restraint, as the Romans practiced it against groups they considered to be barbarians. And let's understand, if the British Crown in 1775 were dealing with Native Americans, might have been a very different situation. All of a sudden, you can treat them the way Rome treated barbarians. Oftentimes with what we would call today genocide. But oftentimes with choices, unlike the Jews and the Gypsies in the Second World War's Holocaust. Oftentimes the choice was surrender and accept subjugation without rebellion and live, or do any of those other things and see everyone either killed or sold into slavery, what passes for a city in your culture destroyed, and maybe your culture itself taken apart piece by piece. There's something very strange maybe about me, but I see a certain romance, doomed sort of romance, the same sort of thing you see with the Native Americans sometimes, where you'll watch this story that is a calamity, and yet at times the behavior of the human beings in it make a tear roll down your cheek and touch something deep in your soul. Those who are willing to say, yes, we know that you'll kill all of us or destroy our civilization if we don't subjugate ourselves to you, but we're going to take the chance here and try to live free or die. Now, I'm not the only one that sees the obvious entertainment value or the compelling nature of the extreme situation a choice like that puts human beings into, because it's a Hollywood cliche, isn't it? A storytelling trope, they would say, maybe in academic circles. A recurring theme. I mean, it would be very easy to tell this story and turn it into Braveheart. We will try very hard not to do that. But it's an old theme, and it's easy to become sort of inured to it over time, sort of numb. The other problem is that these situations that we're talking about, the reality of them is actually so intense and so extreme that any portrayal or discussion of them can't help but somehow minimize or trivialize or hype in a different way for entertainment value what the people were actually going through. I always try to think to myself, imagine if that list that we mentioned a minute ago, that genocide list, imagine if only one of those things was going to happen to me in my cushy life here, where I am in no danger of, say, having my culture wiped out. I can't even imagine what that would mean. Make blue jeans illegal. No more iPhones, and they start destroying the Christian religion. I mean, I'm not quite sure in the modern sense in the United States where I live, how that even, I mean, you can't even get your mind around it. Maybe in some weird, emotionally voyeuristic way, that's what makes it kind of intriguing. As I've always said, you watch people deal with something you can't imagine dealing with yourself. The story that I would like to use to highlight that has a very familiar ring, because we've seen this movie, historically speaking, before, over and over again. Broadly speaking, it's the story of a European power using its technological and civilizational advantages to dominate, take over, and colonize the land of a tribal people, less sophisticated, politically speaking, tribal people, and to destroy broad elements of their culture as part of doing so. Obviously, over the last 500 or so years, we've seen this movie play out in the Americas with European colonization and conquest. We saw it play out in Africa, too, same thing. The difference here is that the people, the tribal people, on the receiving end of European conquest and colonization are themselves European. And this didn't happen a couple hundred years ago. This happened more than 2,000 years ago. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this story as opposed to any of the others with similar themes is because this is one of the times where you look at the odds and you say there's a halfway decent chance here of the people on the receiving end of the European colonization to fight back and win. The Native Americans, for example, never had a chance. Never a chance ever. If for no other reason, and there's a lot of other ones, just the disease alone. If you're about to have a hemispheric civilizational conflict, between the New World and the Old World, you don't want to lose maybe, I saw an estimate that said 98%. I think that's got to be high, but let's just say 85% of the entire population of the hemisphere to disease right off the bat. There are a bunch of experts who've, tried to explain what the situation must have been like in these tribes in the center of the Americas, that were still untouched by European contact, but the diseases managed to find them and were just like shell-shocked, traumatized remnants by the time Europeans got to the interior of the Americans, because these tribes had basically been wiped out by disease. It's like imagine the bubonic plague in Europe, but worse, from the Middle Ages. I've seen numbers that say that in say 1800, they were estimating what the tribal population of North America was. Now, not the North America that constituted the United States in that area back then, because that was just a sliver compared to today, but the native population throughout, from the Pacific to the Atlantic in what's now the United States. Some estimates are as low as 600,000 people. That's a pretty unfair fight right there, isn't it? Not just that, as we all know, that's not 600,000 people all smooshed into one state right next to the 13 colonies when the United States becomes a state, right? It's not like the U.S. has to deal with 600,000 natives next door. They're spread out in small groups, the width and breadth of the territory, able to be picked off, divided and conquered one by one over time, which is what happened. It still blows my mind to realize how small the number of Native American warriors there are fighting against the encroachment of manifest destiny at any time. And how well they did based on how small they were. Do you know if you get 1,500 North American, Native American warriors in one place at one time, that's a sizable force. The highest estimates I've ever seen for the largest Native American force of warriors ever assembled is between 4,000 and 5,000 people. The Little Bighorn, a lot of people think that's the biggest battle. The largest numbers I've ever seen are just under 5,000. 5,000? When the Spanish conquistadors found the Aztec Empire, the Aztecs could raise tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of warriors. Now, obviously, they're a different state organizational system, which plays into this story, but at the same time, it's also first contact, basically, and the disease had not had time to take hold. And then fast forward a couple hundred years, and all of a sudden you go from hundreds of thousands of warriors, maybe, to 1,500 being a sizable force. And look how long it took the U.S. to deal with that. And to be fair, it wasn't like the United States had 100,000 people against 1,500 natives. The forces of the European powers fighting in the New World were very small also. In 1,500 U.S. forces fighting these Native American tribes, half of which might be local militia, that was not uncommon either. Even in the big wars, like the American Revolution, the numbers are smaller than you would think. I mean, again, 25,000 would be a ton in the American Revolution. So you wonder how the U.S., or before them the British and French explorers, would have fared if they were exploring the interior, say, of North America, and they came upon some people that had not been impacted by the disease. I mean, what if the Aztec Empire, instead of being in the middle of Mexico, was on the opposite side of the Mississippi to be run into by the Europeans at some point? Or better yet, let's make it an interesting combat. Let's put ancient Gaul on the western side of the Mississippi. You know what Gaul is, right? Gaul is what the Romans called an area about the size of Texas in the ancient world that comprised, well, most of northwestern Europe, modern-day France, a lot of Belgium, western strip of Germany, some of Switzerland, and during one part of this period, northern Italy even. Estimates of the ancient population range from 3 to 7 million people, and the kind of armies that they could put in the field. Well, let's just say I'd imagine they're pretty close to the kind of numbers that the Aztecs probably could put in the field. An army of 40 or 50,000 Gallic peoples, 5 or 10,000 of which might be mounted, was not unusual. Imagine those armies that are used to brushing aside 1,500 natives, maybe on a really bad day, 2,500 natives having to deal with 40 or 50,000 of them instead. Now, I have no doubt, given the technological advantages and more importantly, the state organizational advantages of a place like the early United States, or before them the British and the French, I have no doubt they would conquer this latter-day version of Gaul at some point. But I wonder if they could conquer it as quickly as Caesar did in the real thing 2,000 years before. And if they couldn't, what does that say? Well, rather than attribute it to any failings or shortcomings of the European or American forces in North America, maybe it says how incredibly awesome Julius Caesar was. But awesome doesn't mean good. And up until relatively recently, what he did in Gaul was celebrated. And in fact, going back 100 or 200 years in the era where the great powers, especially the great powers of Europe, are celebrating the idea of doing exactly what Julius Caesar and the Romans were doing to the tribal peoples north of them in their own era, they tended to see Caesar as the good guy. The story I want to talk about today is narrated by Julius Caesar. It's a little like hearing the Star Wars saga as told by Darth Vader, and it is designed to have the audience cheer when the plucky little republics are crushed. And 100 years ago, a lot of people did. The beginning to my recent translation of Caesar's war commentaries from his command in Gaul, the Carolyn Hammond translation, feels the need at the beginning of the work to explain why yet another translation of Caesar's account of his Well, I had one professor in school in the 80s who called it a Celtic Holocaust. Why a new translation was needed, and Hammond points out, because the views of the audience are different than they used to be. She writes, quote, "A new translation of the Gallic War does call for some explanation, not least because a number of versions are already available. Yet each generation needs its own translation of any classic text. The culture and mores of the translator's own time are bound to leave their mark. Besides, the subject matter of the Gallic War is potentially distasteful, even immoral for the modern reader. The drive to increase territorial holdings, high civilian as well as military casualties, and the predominance of economic motives for organized aggression, all these belong to an accepted norm of international activity in the ancient world, and hence need careful introduction and explanation, as well as up-to-date translation." End quote. Of course, what she's basically saying is that once upon a time, this was written for an audience who was expected to cheer what was going on. Nowadays, we look at things sort of differently and can't help but notice that in the process of achieving these glorious and almost impossible military victories, Julius Caesar is killing, reportedly, 1 million of the inhabitants of Gaul and enslaving another 1 million. As Celtic expert archaeologist Barry Cunliffe says, if you take the low numbers of the entire population of Gaul, that means Caesar killed 1/3 of the population and enslaved another 1/3. Is that genocide? In the Americas, the disease did most of the damage in terms of the overall death rate. In Gaul, in the 50s BCE, Caesar did. Even as I say that, I can hear sort of in the back of my head these screaming objections of the ancient Roman lawyers from the grave of the way that I'm framing this whole thing, comparing Roman efforts against the Celtic peoples north of them to the Holocaust.
Come on, man.
Would be an insult to Roman honor, although there were some who complained about it, Cato, I think. Nonetheless, they would say that to suggest that doing what Caesar did to the Gauls is the same as what happened to the Jews and the Gypsies and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the gay folks and all the other people persecuted in the Holocaust, Roman Catholic priests, Polish folks. Those are like lambs, innocent, led to the slaughter. What Caesar did, he did to a people that were like lions. Dangerous lions. Lions that had attacked before and might do so again. If you are forced, as a state or a people or what have you, to commit genocide in order to protect yourself, is that sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card in any sort of genocidal court situation? I mean, in a judgment call, would you say, well, listen, they had to do it. Anybody would have done it. At the same time, of course, what Caesar was suggesting, and we'll get to that in a minute, was that they needed a preemptive war because these lions could attack at any time. So it gets murky quickly. But there's no denying that these Celtic peoples all over Europe were dangerous. They are Vikings 1,000 years before there are Vikings, and I don't mean in the pirate-like sense. I mean in the European barbarian stereotype sense. And the Vikings are like version 3.4 or something, because the Celts are the alpha version of the Northern European barbarian type. And they exhibit all the typical traits. They get crazy in battle, supposedly, and they fight with enormous amounts of, ferocity. The geographer Strabo said that they are war-mad. The ancient sources also point out that the Celts are headhunters, which is always a little bit unnerving. Ancient peoples are always more comfortable with head chopping than we are in the modern world. But in the more settled societies, when it was done, it was sort of They didn't enjoy it, they didn't revel in it, they didn't take pride in it. It wasn't something you showed off to visitors. But in the Celtic world, according to the ancient sources that were not Celtic, this was something that was done. Posidonius says he's visiting Celtic homes and they want to bring out the heads of slain enemies, that they've kept in a chest, soaked in cedar oil, so everything stays nice and pristine and you can still recognize the features. And they have found, by the way, the archaeology has shown that there are these, for example, pillars that they find with little cubby holes with skulls still in, some of them, by the way, and little hangers to affix the skull to the back of these things. I mean, this may be a religious thing, but to the settled people, cutting the heads off people, keeping them and adorning your temples and whatnot with heads, that's just freaky. And was even then, by the way. Posidonius says he would get used to it after a while, but never quite got comfortable with people treating human heads the way some people treat, the antlers of that deer they shot last fall. Put it up on the wall, mounted with a name tag underneath it. Talk to it sometimes. Always give that great story about how you killed this dude. I should also point out that besides the religious significance of the heads, Caesar says that the Gauls believed in a theory of reincarnation, sort of, maybe you could call it. It was similar to what a major philosophical group in Greece always believed, but the Gauls kind of believed that when you die in this world, you're just born into the other one, and then when you die in the other one, you're just born back into this one. I think I understood that correctly. Caesar says that this is part of the reason why they're so fearless in battle, because instead of being worried about having your existence snuffed out and you're just, in oblivion, you're just going to be born in the next world. Just to avoid confusion, by the way, because it can be very confusing, the terms Gaul and Celt are used by the ancient sources in a way where it's impossible not to get everything confused. Archaeologist John Carlin has a whole rundown of the various ways you can interpret this. The most common way is the way we're going to do it. We're going to assume that when we say Celt, we mean Celtic people across the width and breadth of areas that have Celtic language and culture. If we say Gauls, we specifically mean the Celts in, ancient Gaul, modern-day France, etc., etc. They are, like all these northwestern European barbarian types, white, they are strong, they are tall, especially to all the peoples writing in the Mediterranean. They always look tall. They might have only been like 6 feet if we could go back in a time machine, but if that's 5 or 6 inches taller than your average Mediterranean type, it's still like fighting giants in battle, isn't it? And that's what made fighting these Celtic peoples, scary too. It's not just their enormous numbers, according to the ancient authors, but listen, if you're in a 21st century army, and I tell you, listen, we're going to go to battle, we're going to fight another 21st century army, and oh, by the way, everyone in that army is 6 inches taller than all of us. You might think to yourself, dang, that doesn't sound so good. I don't like the sound of that. At the same time, you realize 7-foot-tall people or whatever they are go down from bullets and shell fire and bombs just like shorter people do, so it's not that big of a deal. But in the ancient world, when you say you're going to fight an army of people that is on average 5 inches taller and proportionately stronger to all the rest of us, when you're doing that in a hand-to-hand sense, it can make a huge difference. The Celtic people were scary, and they had scared Rome before, and all the modern historians point out that this was somehow a scar that ran through the Roman psyche, so that even after the Celts really weren't that dangerous to the Romans anymore, they still felt the memory of lion attacks a long time ago and never quite got over them. If you look at Roman history, there are a couple of famous dates. One of them is 410 AD, right? The famous fall of Rome to the Germanic barbarians. A lot of people like to make that the exclamation point of the end of the Western Roman Empire. Always debatable, of course. But the reason it's such a big deal is basically Rome had been on a huge winning streak. The Joe DiMaggio hitting streak of, ancient runs, in the sense that Rome hadn't been sacked by a foreign conqueror in almost 1,000 years, right? That's
Phoenix
a pretty big
approach
deal in
Cessna
the ancient
Alpha
world.
Sierra X-ray Golf
The last
Sierra
time,
Alpha.
though, that they were sacked,
Request clearance
it was
to
these Celtic
transition
people
Bravo
that did it.
airspace.
And the Romans never forgot it. And there's a famous phrase that sort of sums up the whole period. And I've always wondered if the ancient author, writing when the Roman Empire was around
Cleared
kicking
to Bravo
everybody's
airspace,
butt,
Cessna
didn't
Golf
have a
Sierra
sly
Alpha.
reason for putting it in there, pointing out that, if the Celts could say that back then, well, we can live by those same rules. The line was Vae Victis, or Vae Victis. And the translation usually used is woe to the vanquished, because that's what happened to the Romans famously as a day forever after remembered as an inauspicious day in Rome, July 18th. The first Celtic army that the Romans had ever encountered, supposedly, in their history, bore down on the city itself and were coming at speed to a Rome completely unprepared to meet them. There are a bunch of different ancient historians who've written an account of what happened here. Livy is, of course, the most famous, most romantic, and goes into the most detail about this interesting battle where, I love ancient battles, and you try to recreate what happened, and it's kind of impossible. I mean, people do their best, but the physics of the whole thing are just not understood, and ideas and concepts go in and out of fashion as to what really happened. But there are elements of humanity on an individual level, things like fear and intimidation, and very hard to quantify sides of human beings that are part of, when you take those things collectively, right? What does fear do when you magnify it, into a whole group of people as opposed to one individual? This is the parts of human history that make history hard to turn into any kind of hard science. Because how do you quantify things like that? How do you say that one side in a battle was more scared than another side in a battle, and that's what made the difference? Or that one side was tougher, and that's what made the difference? Because clearly the ancient writers, and let's be honest, historians writing even 50, 100 years ago had no problem saying this, but when you need evidence to prove it, there are certain parts of humanity infused into history that you just can't quantify. I mean, the most logical way, if you want to follow the sources anyway, especially Livy, to view this battle that's about to happen when the Romans and the Celtic armies first clash, supposedly, is to say that the Romans were terrified. And that 2,300 plus years later, it actually seeps through. Can you imagine that you could walk up to one of them that day and say, listen, as afraid as you are, it'll be recorded, and people thousands of years from now will know how scared you are of this alien people coming down from the north. Alien's a key word, too. So you add the fact that these are obviously big people, but the entire look and feel of them has an alien quality that just is scary. And understand, barbarians are always scary to settled societies. Not just scary, sometimes a little sexy. You can see styles that catch on. Like in Rome, they'll start wearing those tight German pants that the barbarians wear. I mean, there's a certain element to them that's a little Clint Eastwood at times. But, I like to think that there's a barbarian scale, 1 to 10, 1 being most barbaric, 10 being one step away from being a Roman with a mustache, And so it depends on where you are. The really cool barbarians walking around Rome in leather jackets, they're more like a 9 or a 10 on the scale. If they get drunk, they could hurt somebody, but otherwise they're pretty well behaved. You take a 1 or a 2 and put them in there, and they're going to be like a bull in a china shop. And that in 390 or 387 BCE is what the Romans are facing on the opposite side of the battlefield. And by the time they get there, according to Livy, the battlefield's already swarming with these people, so you don't even have time to get your lines all straight and everything all figured out. Okay, let's brace ourselves. You are essentially having an encounter battle with a Celtic army heading down toward Rome, and it's about 11 miles away from the city. In all fairness, this is not the Roman Empire or even the Romans of the Julius Caesar era that we normally think of, those terrible badasses that are absolutely frightful. This is a militia army, and at this battle, it's also about half of it is just the citizens, a citizen sort of raising. So you have your militia farmers who do all your fighting for you anyway, and then you have townsfolk and other people. But it's an emergency, and it happened so quickly there was no time, and so they raised this army hastily. Rome at this time is merely a city in Italy, probably the predominant city, but they just had a long conflict with an archenemy Etruscan city that they had just recently defeated, and it was only 10 miles from the city of Rome, so you could see the small scale they're operating on in this era. But this early Roman army,
Phoenix Tower Cessna Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra Alpha is 4 miles east, 2,300 feet with
meets
golf
this
to
army
land.
of huge, tall,
Cessna Alpha
extremely
Sierra
scary
X-ray Golf Sierra
barbarians,
Alpha Phoenix Tower.
and we are told
Altimeter
it takes
29.79
little time
wind 250
before
at
they
20.
are fleeing.
Fly straight
in
in runway
Abject terror.
26.
Livy
That's my
seems to
runway
have
there.
said
Golf
pretty
Sierra Alpha,
openly
follow
that
the
he thinks
generic
the
on final.
commander of the
Wind
Romans at this
250
battle
at
was
20.
incompetent.
Clear to land
He
runway
makes the
26.
Celtic commander
Gotta
out to
follow
be
these
pretty
lights
darn
in.
good.
Those are my lights.
No one knows how many people died at this battle that will be called the Battle of the Elia or the Battle of the Elia
Flaps
River.
down.
500.
And no one knows how many people fought there either, and there are all kinds of different estimates.
Cessna Golf Sierra
And
Alpha,
low
please
ones are
acknowledge.
probably right, though, because in this time period, I know it's hard to imagine this, but
Yeah, I'm
Rome
just
is a
gonna go
true
ahead and say it's
city-state.
supposed to do the auto
Probably
traffic
only
call,
controls,
so-
maybe 30 miles
There we
around
go.
the city, somewhere in that area.
Yeah,
I mean,
this
so
is
this
my
is a
strip
really
right here.
small-scale, very early version of Rome. They probably didn't have too many soldiers to defend
I
them.
said,
United
The problem is
1528,
regardless of
turn
how
next
many of
taxiway.
those soldiers there were, they weren't there anymore after that battle, which means Rome is totally undefended. And a panic sets in the city, we're told. People stream out of it, and the religious artifacts are evacuated, and these terrible choices,
Cessna
we are
Golf
told,
Sierra
are
Alpha,
made.
please
And
acknowledge.
this reminds you of the list of what you would
I
be
don't know how
prepared
to
to die
acknowledge. Is
for.
there a button?
We are told
Clear to
by
land runway
residents in the
26
city where
Cessna
the
Golf Sierra
fighting
Alpha.
men are going to be separated from the useless
Cessna
mouths,
Golf Sierra
including
Alpha,
women
go
and
around.
young people and old people,
Go
to be the
around.
ones who defend the center citadel of the city. I mean,
United
it's this
1528
story of
exit runway when
impending
able.
doom.
I don't think I'm gonna go around. I think I'm gonna land.
My favorite piece of Livy, maybe, in its entirety, though, is what happens when the Gauls, the Celtic people, the army, the first army that the Romans supposedly had encountered of these alien northerners, shows up outside the gates of Rome.
Cessna Golf
And
Sierra
they're
Alpha,
open.
acknowledge last transmission.
The city seems both deserted
Going around
and
Cessna Golf
simply
Sierra
left
Alpha.
unlocked and
Fine.
unguarded.
I'll go around.
And Livy paints a picture of a scene that's like something out of the Twilight Zone.
Really?
You have these
United
maybe
1528,
superstitious
turn next
natives. Like I said,
taxiway.
they're often portrayed
I don't
very
know.
similarly to how you would
They
see,
said to go around,
the
but-
Native Americans or African
Oh, that's probably
tribesmen
why right there.
are
Hey,
somehow
what's up,
extremely
plane?
superstitious and both savage and skittish
United
and
1528,
unpredictable and
contact ground on
childlike. And
119er
it's these
decimal
interesting
75.
stereotypes.
Yeah, that's why I went around.
But here's the story that Livy paints, and it involves the great old men of Rome from another time, the ancient ones
Going
who
to
are still
119er
around
decimal
with long
75,
beards,
United
as he says,
1528.
after the fashion of their day. They're neither useless mouths nor able to fight in the citadel, so they decide, Livy says, that they're going to set an example by simply sacrificing their lives in the hopes that that somehow maybe helps things with the gods or whatnot. He says these generals from the past who celebrated triumphs a long time ago, and these senators and august people who are now the elders in society put on their most elaborate and decorated robes of higher office, went to their homes in the posh section of Rome,
Sky Harbor
and sat
Airport
in their
information golf
chairs of high
0800
office, their
Zulu.
ivory chairs,
Wind
and
250
waited
at
like
20.
silent statues
Visibility
for death to
10.
find them.
Sky condition,
Here's how
no
Livy
clouds below
describes
12.
The Celts coming
Temperature,
into the city
35.
of Rome, and it's like a ghost
Dew point,
town with the
10.
gates open.
Altimeter,
and they don't know
29er
what to
decimal
do, and
79er.
They freak out a little bit.
ILS
and an
runway
incident happens
26
that's
visual
wild.
runway 25 right and ILS
Touches
runway
off
25
the
left
forest
in use.
fire of Gallic impetuosity.
Landing and departing runway
This,
26
by the
runway
way,
25
from the
right
Aubrey
and runway
to Selling
25
Book
left.
translation. Here's what
VFR
Livy writes,
aircraft
quote,
say direction of flight.
a night having
aircraft
passed
read
without
back, hold
action,
short
the
instructions.
Gauls found their lust for
Advise controller
fighting
on
much
initial
abated.
contact. You have
At
golf.
no time had they met with any serious
Fly left
resistance,
downwind
and there was no
runway,
need
26
now
Cessna
to
Golf
take the
Sierra
city by
Alpha.
assault. When therefore they entered on the
Phoenix
following
Tower,
day,
Cessna
it
Alpha
was
Sierra
coolly
X-ray
and
Golf
calmly
Sierra
enough.
Alpha
The
1600
Colleen Gate
feet
was
touch and
open,
go.
and they made their way to
Phoenix
the
Tower,
forum,
Cessna
looking
Alpha
with
Sierra X-ray
curiosity
Golf
at the
Sierra
temples and at
Alpha
the citadel,
1700
the only
feet
place
touch
to
and
give an
go.
impression of a city at war. They left a reasonably strong guard in case of attack from the fortified heights, and then dispersed in search of plunder, finding the streets empty.
Clear
Crowds
touch
of them
and go
broke
runway
into the
26
first houses
Cessna
they
Golf
came
Sierra
to.
Alpha.
Others went
I'm not
farther
doing a touch and
afield,
go, I'm landing.
presuming supposedly that
Phoenix
buildings
Tower,
more
Cessna
remote from the
Alpha Sierra
forum would offer
X-ray Golf
richer
Sierra
prizes.
Alpha is
But there,
unfamiliar
the
with
very
the area.
silence and solitude
Request
made them uneasy,
directions to the airport.
separated as they were from their companions,
Phoenix
and
Tower,
suggested
Cessna
the
Alpha
possibility
Sierra
of a
X-ray
trap.
Golf Sierra
So they
Alpha
soon
is
returned,
unfamiliar with
keeping
the
close
area.
together, to the
Request
neighborhood of the forum.
directions to the airport.
Here they found the humbler houses locked and barred, but the mansions of the nobility open. The former they were ready to break into, but it was a long time before they could bring themselves to enter the latter. Something akin to awe held them back at what met their gaze. Those figures seated in the open courtyards, the robes and decorations, august beyond reckoning. The majesty expressed in those grave, calm eyes, like the majesty of gods. They might have been statues in some holy place, and for a while, the Gallic warriors stood entranced. Then, on an impulse, one of them touched the beard of a certain Marcus Papirius. It was long, as was the fashion of those days, and the Roman struck him on the head with his ivory staff. That was the beginning. The barbarian flamed into anger and killed him, and the others were butchered where they sat. From that moment, no mercy was shown. Houses were ransacked, and the empty shells set on fire. End quote. Whether or not that happened, that's a pretty cool and interesting scene, and a romantic and super Roman patriot like Livy probably saw it that way too. Nonetheless, who knows what sources he was working from? As the story goes on, basically, the Gauls sack Rome, set fire to a bunch of it, and start this siege because they can't take the fortified citadel in the middle. The ancient sources differ on what happens next, but the famous story is that a siege develops, both sides want to call the siege off, they come to an agreement, 1,000 pounds of gold, right? If the Romans will pay 1,000 pounds of gold, the Gauls will leave. And then as they're weighing the gold out, one of the Romans famously complains that the weights have been doctored with, and the Gauls are falsifying the weights to their advantage, and the king of this tribe walks up to the scale, takes his big heavy sword, throws it on the Gaul side of the scale, and says, "Woe to the vanquished." Meaning, what are you going to do if the weights are loaded in our favor? You lost. Pay up. Now, I was reading a fantastic book on early Rome called War and Society in Early Rome by Jeremy Armstrong. And he floats an idea that a lot of others have floated too. The idea that basically it's this conquering and sacking of the city of Rome, 1,000 years almost before the next time that they will do it, that will create the Rome we all know. What's that line from the Batman series where the Joker says to him, "You made me"? It's the same thing we said with this "woe to the vanquished" line that Livy throws in, right? It's almost like the Romans hundreds of years later saying, "Hey, you set the rules, so we're playing by them. Woe to the vanquished. This isn't genocide, what we're doing in Celtic land when Julius Caesar conquers all these tribes. This is playing by the rules that you set up when you first conquered us. You made me." And Armstrong points out that the actual sacking of Rome may not have been too terrible because the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to support some, terrible Carthaginian solution type burning to the ground or anything. But for the Romans, that probably wasn't the problem. It was probably a lot more what a lot of the writers who write about the Romans quite a bit point out, that they have this inability to accept defeat and humiliation, and whereas most people probably would write something off and move along with their lives, the Romans fester and focus on things and remember old slights and wounds. And the psychological seeds for that, if not planted, may have been heavily watered as a result of Roman experience after losing to supposedly this first Celtic army they ever fought at the Battle of the Ilia, and then seeing their city sacked by them. By the way, I should point out, because I think it's cool, that the old idea that this is a tribe of Celtic people that has shown up to sack Rome is challenged by a lot of historians, and there's people on both sides who suggest that the evidence shows that this may have been a group of hired mercenaries instead, that had been hired by a ruler on the modern-day island of Sicily to fight with him, and that Rome was just on the way, and what the heck, we'll sack it, pick up a couple of extra bucks to get on the way, while we're doing it. So this idea that what we have here is a tribe may be wrong. And it's kind of important because when Caesar's conquering Gaul hundreds of years later, they'll be talking about, that tribe over there, those are the ones that, sacked our country 340 years ago. Those Romans have long memories. unfortunately, not just for the Celts, but for everyone. And it's worth pointing out that, in 390, when this battle happens, the Celtic peoples of Europe are very powerful. And they're all over the place. And who they are is a great question. Once upon a time when it was easy to classify these things in ways that sounded easy to understand but now seem totally ridiculous, they were a race. Celts were a race like Anglo-Saxons were a race, right? I mean, all these, you divide the world into the different racial groups, and these are the yellow people, and these are the black people, and these are the white people. I mean, 100 years ago, you open up a history book, and that's how they do it. As the complexities mounted and that whole way of looking at things went out of fashion 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the Celts are an ethnic group or a people. That's how I grew up, reading a guy like Michael Grant, who, like everyone else, sort of insinuated most of the time that these Celtic people were probably all related by blood. Those people that sacked Rome in 390 BCE are the ancestors of the people in Ireland, 500 years later, or today. Nowadays, that's a pretty tough argument to make, given the way it's seen amongst most of the experts. And I don't mean to speak for them, because this Celtic study stuff is fascinatingly debatable, and the passion with which the experts go at it is fun to watch from the sidelines, but it means you have to be really careful. And there are a lot of people out there who are very passionate about their view of who a Celt is and who is not a Celt.
I don't know how to turn it off.
Barry Cunliffe, who I mentioned earlier, puts it, because it gets me out of all kinds of trouble to say it the way he said it. He said a Celt is a person who believes him or herself to be Celtic. I thought of a t-shirt that I should market. I'm going to make it green, of course, and I'm going to say Celtic. It's not a nationality, it's a way of life. But the point is the same. The modern view of a lot of the experts on this, and they're archaeologists, linguists, historians, they all kind of look at this and differ, is that what we're looking at here is a culture, a shared culture and similar language, maybe. Like blue jeans, rock and roll and beer drinking. It's something that spread sort of in prehistory to a bunch of different peoples.
Landing. I might want to practice my landing.
Foundation of which might have been in place since the last ice age, if you think about it. And then over time, succeeding waves of people and immigrants and inmarrying and all that adds layers of spice to the original. But when they do DNA tests today, it's hard to not find lots of people who have been there since. Lots of DNA strands that have been there for very long.
The end of that flight. I don't know what happened there with air traffic control at the end, but again, I'm super new to this game. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to end this here, but I'm going to be doing a lot of landing practice between this and the next stream. The next stream will actually be me and my dad flying together, and that will be tomorrow, so we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, I'm going to get my landing